This is Andrea Peters with the World Socialist Web Site. On this evening's program, we're going to be discussing David North's new book, A Quarter Century of War, The U.S. Drive for Global Hegemony, a collection of speeches, articles, and correspondence written between 1990 and 2016. This is an immensely timely work. The U.S.'s bloody incursions in the Middle East continue to escalate and increasingly threaten a direct military confrontation with Russia. On the other side of the globe, Washington pursues an aggressively anti-Chinese agenda, with the real possibility that disputes over the South China Sea will erupt into a full-blown conflict. In the upcoming election, the American people confront two despised candidates, both warmongers. Hillary Clinton, the chosen favorite of the military intelligence apparatus, has made McCarthyite anti-Russian hysteria a centerpiece of her campaign against the fascistic Donald Trump. The disgust felt within the broader population for the social and human costs of war finds no expression in official political life. How is it possible that 25 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, an event that media pundits claim would usher in a period of peace and prosperity, the world stands on the brink of a new world war and inequality has reached unprecedented levels? And what is the socialist answer? David North's new volume takes up these and many more questions. Its writings chart the explosion of American militarism, beginning with the lead-up to the First Persian Gulf War and concluding with the wars of the Obama administration. The volume's contents are remarkable for their far-sightedness and analytical depth. In addition to outlining the Marxist perspective on what is driving the destruction of the global order, the author devotes particular attention to the role played by academics and supposedly left-wing political tendencies in championing America's wars. David is the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist Web Site and the national chairperson of the Socialist Equality Party. He has been a Trotskyist and active in the socialist movement for over 40 years. David has recently published a number of new works which deal with fundamental questions of Marxist philosophy and methods, the history of the 20th century, and the life and legacy of Leon Trotsky, co-leader of the Russian Revolution. In addition to myself and David, joining us in our conversation this evening is WSWS reporter Andre Damon. David, I'd like to begin tonight by talking about the overall theme of the book, A Quarter Century of War. What about this period from 1990 to 2016 is distinctive? I mean, the U.S. has been involved in overseas military actions elsewhere around the globe during the 20th century for decades, Vietnam, Korea, for instance. So why did you focus on this period?
Well, I think that it actually, both chronologically but also in historical fact, is a distinctive period. The end of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, and 2 years leading up to it, the dissolution of the Stalinist regimes in Eastern Europe, was followed by a wave of triumphalism, the so-called end of history. And it was proclaimed that this was a sort of new beginning of the historical process. The old conflicts of the past, of the 20th century, had been superseded, and a new era of peace and prosperity within a framework dominated by the unchallenged hegemony of capitalism, and within that framework the United States would open up new historical vistas. Now, we have the ability now, after some 25 years, a quarter century, to critically evaluate that and draw certain conclusions as to what this period really has represented in terms of world history. In a sense, the underlying theme of my previous book, The Unfinished 20th Century, which deals with specifically historical questions, is continued in this book as it examines the geopolitical consequences of the so-called end of history. Far from being an end of history, what we are somehow witnessing today is the repetition on a higher scale of the very conflicts which produced the catastrophes of the 20th century. It is remarkable when one thinks, here we are in 2016, we are soon going to be observing the 100th anniversary of the most significant event in 20th and possibly in world history, the Russian Revolution. 100 years ago, exactly 100 years ago, in 1916, Lenin was analyzing the political and economic foundations of the First World War, and he understood that this war would give rise and would culminate in a massive revolutionary upheaval. And he was correct. No one, of course, could have foreseen in the autumn of 1916 how soon that perspective was to be realized. But we are living in a world which, for all that has changed, is very, very similar. And when we look back over the past 25 years, I think historians are going to see it as a period of intensifying crisis, a period which ushered in a new epoch of war and revolution.
You begin to make certain prognoses about how the geopolitical situation is going to develop. For instance, you, in one of the opening sections of the book, talk about how the lead up to the First Persian Gulf War is marking a new imperialist redivision of the world. You even talk about the potential for the growth of conflicts with Russia and China. I'm wondering how the historical perspective that you have shapes both then and now your ability to make these kinds of prognoses. What sort of allowed you, from the standpoint of 1990, to look out in the world and see certain tendencies of development that have come to fruition today?
Well, the Socialist Equality Party, we weren't the Socialist Equality Party in 1990, we were then the Workers' League, but it was working in solidarity with the International Committee of the Fourth International. And the Fourth International, and those who work within it, have the benefit of basing themselves on this enormous political, theoretical, historical legacy associated, above all, with the struggle of Leon Trotsky and the vast historical conception of world development that directed his work. And I mean, the Fourth International was founded in 1938 as the World Party of Socialist Revolution. It was founded on the eve of the Second World War. So the whole history of the Fourth International, it provides a vast historical capital, a capital of historical knowledge upon which one can draw. And I think it's important to understand that when when we were looking at and obviously considering the implications of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we were very mindful of the historical framework. I mean, the question which arose, I've already referred to it in my previous, when we began this interview, was the end of the Soviet Union, the end of history. But our framework was very much to look at the development from the standpoint of the whole historical path since 1917. The issue was, did the end of the Soviet Union represent the end, as many were claiming, and particularly Professor Hobsbawm, the end of this whole process of revolutionary upheaval, which the Russian Revolution had initiated. Now, he advanced the concept of the short 20th century. This became a sort of academic truism. The end of the USSR had settled the question of socialism and socialist revolution for all time. It wasn't going to happen. It was a Marxist chimera which had been disproven. Of course, the great advantage of Trotskyism as the development of Marxism in the course of the 20th century was that, first of all, it never viewed Stalinism and the Soviet Union as it evolved from the 1920s and 30s on as a legitimate expression of Marxist and revolutionary policies. Our analysis was that the Soviet Union was a degenerated worker state, that the Stalinist regime represented the exact opposite, or the counter-revolutionary opposite of the world revolutionary perspective of Marxism. Stalinism was rooted in the theory of socialism in one country, that it had abandoned the perspective of social revolution, and what had come to an end in 1991 was not the perspective of Marxism, but really the perspective of national, autarkic, anti-socialism with which the Stalinist regime was identified. And this was, I think, critical in another sense in terms of how we understood the world situation. I think that perhaps the most significant element of the analysis of the International Committee at that time was that it related the end of the Soviet Union, or it understood the dissolution of the Soviet Union, not in national terms, not as a crisis simply of the Soviet Union, but rather more broadly a crisis of the whole national state system. Ultimately, what failed in the USSR was a perspective of national economic development. The Soviet regime was a regime which was based on a program of national economic autarky. That had totally failed. But the same problem, which brought about ultimately the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that is the inability to maintain national economy in an epoch in which world economy was overwhelmingly the dominant factor, affected the capitalist regimes as well, the capitalist states as well. And therefore, in a more fundamental sense, the problem of the relationship of the national state system to global economy confronted the United States, confronted all the major capitalist powers. If one goes back and, in fact, reviews the history of world economy from 1970 on, particularly 1970 to 1990, the reason why no one, or at least no bourgeois analyst, foresaw the end of the Soviet Union was because they didn't really understand the basic problems which were confronting world economy as a whole. So the problem of national economic policy, unviable for the USSR, was unviable for the United States as well. And the period between 1970 and 1990 was, in fact, a period of mounting economic and political crisis within the United States, as the United States more and more was witnessing and experiencing the consequences of the deterioration of its dominant global economic role. That is, the role it had achieved through the First and Second World War. That had run its course by the early 1970s. And so the history, economically and politically, of the United States during that period is one of mounting crisis. And indeed, I think recalling that period, and I'm not just being wise after the event, but it's recorded in documents which were written and produced by the International Committee, particularly in between 1985 and 1990. The question, in a certain sense, was who would go first? Would the crisis of world economy and the pressures it brought to bear on the national state system produce an economic breakdown and immense economic, political upheaval in the United States and the advanced capitalist states, or would it first erupt in the Soviet Union, or would it be some combination of the two? So in that sense, we were prepared to evaluate the end of the USSR in broader international terms and see it far from being a confirmation of capitalism and a vindication of capitalism, but as an event which was only, however dramatic, the first major episode in a developing global crisis.
This economic crisis mounting in the United States and elsewhere around the world that you were just talking about is part of the driver of this explosion of militarism and imperialism that really takes off in 1990. Is that correct?
Well, yes. I mean, broadly, I just was reviewing a document in preparation for this interview, which was published by the International Committee in 1988, which was a world perspective document, and it placed central emphasis on the significance of a process which at that point was not being referred to very widely, and that was globalization. We were speaking about the significance of the emergence of a new form of international capitalist corporate organization, the development from multinational to transnational corporations, the emergence of a far broader internationally, on an international scale, of vast growth of the working class. And so we were already placing immense emphasis on the contradiction between global production, the global integration of capitalist production and finance, and its collision, or the contradiction between that, and the antiquated, archaic national state system.
This is Andre Damon. Just wanted to remind our readers that these types of programs are made possible by your donations. I would encourage you to donate to the World Socialist website at wsws.org/donate. I just wanted to shift gears a little bit to take on one of the questions that is presented in some detail in the book vis-a-vis the Iraq War, particularly the question of the doctrine of preemptive war and the use of such a doctrine to justify the eruption of U.S. militarism and imperialism. And you took a lot of time to explain the illegality and criminality of U.S. foreign policy with regard to the invasion of Iraq. Could you speak a little bit more on that topic?
Well, yes. Let me just perhaps introduce the topic by pointing out, and we referred to it on several occasions, that immediately after the Gulf War of 1991, the United States introduced, or began to introduce, a new military doctrine, which stated that, in essence, the United States would not tolerate the emergence of any global competitor. In other words, it began to elaborate a doctrine of American military political hegemony, which had far-reaching implications. This doctrine, as it evolved, finally took the form in 2002 of a official promulgation of a military strategy which centered on the legitimization of preventive warfare. Now, what this actually means is that the United States took the position that it had the right to go to war and use war as an instrument of policy in order to meet any potential threat to its dominant global position. Now, this was essentially a repudiation of another far older legal concept of preemptive war, which sanctioned war only under conditions in which there existed a direct and immediate threat of military attack. Now, in the aftermath of the events of 9/11, which I'm sure we'll come back to, the United States declared that it faced a threat from Iraq and the so-called weapons of mass destruction, which was not only unproven, it was an out-and-out lie. But it began to essentially use this and other arguments to say that it had a right to engage in warfare, and attack and invade not just Iraq and Afghanistan, but potentially any country which was viewed as a potential threat. Now, how this emerged as we were holding meetings in opposition to the preparations for war, I gave a fair number of lectures, and I was struck. I would ask, in dealing with the issue of preventive war, I would often ask students if they could explain or or state what was the basis of the prosecution of Nazi leaders at Nuremberg following the Second World War. And most students, if they were familiar with the Nuremberg trials, would state that the main charge against the Nazis were crime against humanity, the Holocaust, the killing of Jews and other horrific crimes which that regime carried out. And I would then point out to them that while, yes, such crimes were part or were listed or were among the indictments, the main charge brought against the Nazi war criminals, the first charge, was that they were guilty of crimes against peace. So that is, and this was the center of the theory of prosecution at Nuremberg, was that the use of war as an instrument of policy to achieve certain political aims was illegal. This is actually an enormously significant, fascinating story because, just to place it in context, the very idea of having war crimes trials was very controversial at the time. There was not really a established body of law on this issue. But at any rate, the lead American prosecutor was Robert Jackson, and Robert Jackson had been was a Supreme Court judge who took a leave of absence from the Supreme Court to go to Nuremberg. And he would present this argument very, very forcefully. That is the following. He said that, look, the issue before the court was not whether Germany had reasons to be dissatisfied with its existing situation, such as dissatisfaction with Versailles. He said, look, that's a matter for historians to judge, whether Germany had reasons, whether those reasons were legitimate or illegitimate. That's not the issue before the court. The issue before the court was whether Germany decided to deal with its dissatisfactions through the use of military action, through war. And the argument made by the American prosecutors was that the use of war as an instrument of policy was itself illegal. And that was the basis of the prosecution. Robert Jackson specifically stated, as did other members of the prosecution team, was that the United States itself would have to be willing to have the same standard applied against itself in the future. Now, of course, it was violated again and again. The United States, in practice, rejected the Nuremberg principle, but in fact, not until 2002, with the promulgation of the doctrine of preventive war, did it do so positively and explicitly. And I might point out that repudiation was reiterated essentially by Hillary Clinton in the debate when she was specifically asked, would the United States forswear the first strike use of nuclear weapons, and she refused to answer. I thought it was perhaps the most significant event in last night's debate. When she was directly asked this question, she refused to repudiate the use of nuclear weapons. So we're at a very advanced stage of the repudiation of international law. The United States holds to a theory of warfare for which the ringleaders of the Nazi regime were hanged in 1946.
We're speaking this evening today with David North about his new book, A Quarter Century of War, The U.S. Drive for Global Hegemony, 1990 to 2016. It is available for purchase at Mering Books, mering.com. There's a special sale price today on both the softcover and the hardcover versions. David, a lot of what you're talking about at the moment, I think, are issues that came up in a debate that you participated in at Trinity College in Dublin. I'm wondering if maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that event, how it was organized, and I'm also thinking about the fact that this was happening sort of at the height of the wars of the Bush administration, and there was at that time an anti-war movement. There was a discussion on campuses, at colleges, universities around the world. That doesn't really seem to be happening today during the Obama period. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you think has shifted from this time when you were speaking at Trinity College to the current climate.
Well, what you're referring to in the remarks which I made at Trinity College in Dublin are included in a chapter in the book. Just on that meeting, I was invited by the Philosophical Society of Trinity College. Also invited, I understand, was Paul Wolfowitz and Geoffrey Hoon, who was the defense minister in the British government. In the last minute, they declined to show up. But the debate did go forward. Among those debating was, I think, the present editor of The Economist. And the proposition before the House was that the United States is the world's principal peacekeeper. I was obviously arguing in the negative, and I must say it was by far the more popular position. I don't know whether it was because I'd like to think my arguments were very strong, but certainly my positions were more popular with the students, and the losing side, the Economist editor, then said to me afterwards that he too thought we had won the debate. But I think going back to that period of 2003, and I think this is actually, that took place somewhat later, it was 2004, but it's true, in 2002, 2003, on the eve of the Second Iraq War, there was substantial opposition to the war. There were enormous demonstrations that took place all over the world against the preparations of the Bush administration for an invasion of Iraq. It is remarkable when one considers that in the 13 years that has followed, there have been no such demonstrations. The issue of war has virtually disappeared. And there are very definite political reasons for this, and I think it's bound up with the fact that the political tendencies, which were for many decades were associated with anti-war movements, so-called, going back to the period of Vietnam, the political tendencies and the social forces upon which they were based shifted their positions radically. And I think an important part, if I can refer to the book, is when we were analyzing the aftermath of the Balkan War, we placed emphasis, and I think this was entirely correct for the International Committee to do this, we placed a great deal of emphasis on the profound shift brought about by the explosion of the markets in the 1990s and the profound and far-reaching impact that had on sections of the middle class. I think if we speak of the level of social inequality and the emergence of a highly privileged affluentia, roughly the top 10%, this was a social layer. Many of them, both personally but part of a broader social context, people who had been students in the late 60s, early 70s, they then participated in this process of enrichment brought about by exploding share prices, exploding asset values, the increasing alienation of this layer from broader sections of society, and moreover the fact that the actual mode of wealth acquisition was very much based on market speculation. The conditions which gave rise to the explosion of the stock exchange were very much the same conditions which inversely produced a vast lowering in the conditions of life of the working class. And it was a very objective process. The wealth of this affluent elite depended more and more on social, economic, political, and military policies, which were the exact opposite of those of the broader masses. So I think that as we explain, an entire social layer emerged, benefiting from high share values, from low inflation, low commodity prices, and as a consequence became increasingly sympathetic and tolerant of militarism. And that takes the most extreme form today when not only is there an absence of anti-war demonstrations, but political tendencies previously associated with the left, and we've been writing at some length about organizations such as the ISO, which have its history in Shachtmanite state capitalist policies, as well as the Pabloite tendencies, who are enthusiastically advocating intensified American escalation in Syria, as they did previously in the 1990s, as they favored and supported a war in the Balkans.
Well, I'm very much struck, David, by this the analysis of the Balkan crisis in the book, because so many of the social and political tendencies, particularly the justification of the U.S. war drive by social layers that previously considered themselves anti-war, is really taking place in full force in the conflict in Syria. Of course, you and Alex Lantier recently published a article analyzing the positions of the ISO in Syria. And I was wondering if you could speak more on that. What role have what we have called and defined as the pseudo-left, and defined in your book as the pseudo-left, what role have they played in the current drive to war?
Well, I think, the challenge which one faces as a Marxist is to view these processes not subjectively, not from the standpoint of the evil intentions and plans of one or another individuals. Obviously, we write about what different people put down on paper or post on the internet. But we're really talking about a social differentiation. And again, a theme of the book, which what comes up repeatedly, is the relationship of what one might call the academic intelligentsia to war, not just the political tendencies who we might refer to as opponent tendencies. It's part of a much broader social phenomena. In analyzing the growth of pro-war opportunism during the First World War between 1914 and 1917, Marxists at that time were confronted with the collapse of the Second International. And in Lenin's analysis of imperialism, and in the section which he called the critique of imperialism, he explained the objective basis for the growth of opportunism. And he placed emphasis on the emergence of a very privileged strata of the workers' movement, the labor lieutenants of capital, a section, the trade union bureaucracies, the social democratic bureaucracies, who, as he said, lived off of the crumbs of the table of imperialism. Of course, that persists to this day, but what was new in the 1990s, and it was very much bound up with the increasingly parasitic character of contemporary capitalism, the extraordinary role played by international finance, the dominant role of the equity markets, and so on, that this led to a staggering enrichment of sections of the middle class who, on that basis, changed their policies. They changed their social orientation. And I think one simply cannot overlook this economic factor. So when we look at the element of social inequality and what is its political ramifications, one can see if we have, as we've explained many times, why is it that after 15 years or even 25 years of war, there is not an anti-war movement? The issues which have been of concern to these tendencies, whether they're Pabloite or state capitalists or sort of left groupings, we refer to them as pseudo-left groupings, the issues that have been of interest to them have not been the issues of economic inequality, but they have been fixated on questions of personal identity, of race, gender, sexuality, and in other words, of issues and interests which are of primary interest to the more privileged strata of the middle class. And we're not denying, certainly, that there are legitimate democratic issues involved in many of these issues. But when one counterposes these or places these in the context of a world situation in which one has massive poverty, the escalation of military violence, and the real danger of nuclear annihilation, the priorities of such tendencies are, of course, very, very distant from those of the broad mass of people.
David, I'd like to continue our discussion of some this issue that you've raised, what you refer to in your book as the constituency for imperialism. And you talk both now and in your book about this concept of the pseudo-left. In particular, you have a statement about the positions of the International Socialist Organization, and you actually just mentioned them. In the book, your statement addresses their position on Syria and what they declare to be the Syrian Revolution. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this. I know that you and Alex Lantier also just recently published a statement on some of their more recent commentary on this.
Well, I mean, as we say, it's published in the Perspective today. Alex makes the point that if you simply take what they are writing in their publications, and that goes for Gilbert Ashkar as well, and
of the ISO.
That Ashley Smith of the ISO, but it's they're only the most extreme of what one reads widely. I mean, they speak of a Syrian revolution when it's well known. It's not a discovery of the World Socialist Web Site or of our intrepid correspondents. It's very well known that the organizations which are waging, behind the civil war in Syria are supported by Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, the United States. I mean, this is not something which we have alleged and people are saying to us, my God, how could you possibly make such a claim? This is well established. And even from a political standpoint, when it talks about a revolution, every revolution has a history. It has a history of doctrinal struggle, of theoretical works. The tendencies are well known. One reads about the Syrian revolution, and those who are endorsing it never bother to provide us with background material which we can read in order to inform ourselves of the significant theoretical disputes, the manner in which the program of these insurgent tendencies took shape. And of course, it's because it's a fraud, and with terrifically tragic consequences for the masses throughout the Middle East.
I'd like to ask our listeners and readers to feel free to ask questions on the comment thread. So just to begin with the reader's question, how can you say that the economic factors leading to the dissolution of the USSR were not unique to that administration alone? Isn't comparing the nationalized economy of the USSR to the globally integrated economies of the advanced capitalist countries today comparing apples to oranges?
Well, they may be apples and oranges, but they're all in the same orchard. And I think that that is a somewhat provincial way of approaching it. I mean, there is a world economy, and particularly as the Soviet economy became increasingly complex, the very impact of industrial development compelled the Soviet Union and the Eastern European regimes, which were allied with the USSR, compelled them to seek the resources of world economy and have access to those resources. And there were only two ways that could be achieved, either through a process of international revolution, the overthrow of capitalism in the advanced countries, or through the dissolution of the Stalinist regimes and their integration into the structures of world capitalism. The bureaucracy certainly chose the latter. But the same problems, in, of course, somewhat different form, nevertheless existed in the advanced or throughout the capitalist world. I mean, the era of national development is over, and I think even the issues which arose in last night's mud wrestle between Clinton and Trump illustrated that. I mean, he is the great controversy in these different factions of the ruling elite was over the impact of trade agreements. I mean, Trump is calling for back to the national hearth, the erection of barriers and borders to protect sacred national American industry. Of course, that is a dystopian nightmare. It's impossible. At the same time, the path of driving American military policy is its own efforts to break down all national barriers of other countries to the hegemony of American capitalism. So in different ways, these factions of the ruling class are trying to deal with the collision between the dependence on the resources of global economy, access to resources, access to cheap labor, dominance of markets, and to achieve that and break down whatever barriers they confront in the national state system. I mean, what we're witnessing today on a scale which dwarfs what occurred in 1914 or 1939 is a struggle for control of world economy by the major imperialist powers. And the central axis of the two fundamental characters of that collision, of course, are first of all the conflict between national state and world economy, and then the conflict between private ownership of the means of production, which is embedded in the capitalist state system, and the necessity of social production to find unfettered global expression through the social revolution.
What I'm struck by, reviewing the book in light of the debate yesterday's debate, which you pointed to, is the immense contemporary relevance of these questions. We've written on the World Socialist website that this election is dominated by the question of war. And it seems that all of the processes that you've identified in the book and have contemporaneously analyzed are finding ever more developed expression and continuously escalating and deepening. My question to you is, having completed this analysis of this 25-year period, how do you see both the present immediate election situation as well as the next 10 to 15 years? What do you see on the horizon?
Well, I think it's stated fairly clearly in the book. I mean, the contradictions which exist, which I've just sort of identified or defined again, they're not going to be resolved peacefully. If you were to ask me the question, what is the possibility of the conflict between the United States and China and Russia resolving itself peacefully, or for that matter, the escalating conflict between the United States and its so-called European allies, particularly Germany, what is the possibility of a peaceful resolution of these conflicts? I would say that they are exactly nil. They cannot be peacefully resolved. They've never been peacefully resolved in the past, and the whole lesson of the 20th century, of World War I and World War II, provides an answer to that issue. So I think the central question which we confront today is there any objective existing obstacle to the development of global war? Unless you're mad, one must recognize that the consequence of a war, particularly one which went nuclear, would be devastating. Before I, in fact, give my answer, I just brought with me, I just downloaded a statement which has been released by the Atlantic Council. It's called The Future of the Army. So if among our listeners there's anyone who thinks I may just be exaggerating, I'm talking about war, and this is just a Marxist dogmatic approach, I think it's worth, I really urge all of our listeners to download this incredible document, The Future of the Army. And it gives you a sense of what the ruling class thinks the future will bring. They write, and I'm quoting from page 5, it says the following: even if the United States defeats ISIS in Iraq and Syria, it is becoming increasingly clear that the threat posed by radical Islamic ideology will not disappear. The threat may change and adapt as it spreads around the world. Now, he speaks of the danger posed by Russian resurgence and blatant aggression, and he also refers to the fact, according to them, that, quote, China has become increasingly aggressive. So what is the conclusion? The authors write, quote, in many ways, the United States has entered an era of perpetual war, since it will have to continue addressing the various manifestations of this threat for years and probably decades to come. Now, somewhat further on, the following statement is made. They talk about the future of the American military. It says, unpleasant as it is to contemplate, the Army must improve its capacity to sustain large numbers of casualties and keep fighting. This requires not only depth of personnel within units, but also depth in the numbers and types of units to avoid single-point failures if key units are wiped out. Its ongoing investments in individual resistance must be matched with planning for rapid organizational recovery. Doctrine and training for this chilling eventuality must be revitalized, and leaders must be prepared to regroup and sustain operations and fighting spirit in the face of heavy losses. Training should expose units to mass rocket and artillery fires, chemical attacks, and even nuclear attacks in order to simulate the large-scale losses that would require reorganization to continue the mission. Now that's how the ruling class sees the future. This is, I'm sure that Hillary Clinton has read this cover to cover. She wasn't asked about it last night. They're not talking about it. They just would like to get through the election and then get on to real business. So when we if we simply look at what the professionals in these affairs are writing, those who are working at the highest levels of the capitalist state, they certainly see a future, as they say, of perpetual war. Now, what then are the implications? What is the standpoint of the working class? Question is there any force which stands objectively opposed to this development? And that is where we insist that the only way the drive toward war can be stopped is through the development of an international movement of the working class. That is, we adhere to the same conception which inspired Lenin between 1914 and 1917, and of course Trotsky, and which formed the very basis of the founding of the Fourth International as the World Party of Socialist Revolution. Now, this is not a utopian conception. This is one which is based on an understanding that the very objective contradictions which give rise to war, which drive the ruling elites to war, whether they like it or not, are the same contradictions which give rise to social revolution. That is the decisive issue that, and we represent in our work, and I hope that the book itself demonstrates that, both in its content and in the perspective and in the, I think, substantiation of much of what's written, that the revolutionary factor in the situation is the working class. And we have quoted Trotsky. He says aptly, we follow not the war map, but we follow the map of the class struggle. And that is, we identify the working class on a global scale as the basic anti-revolutionary force that exists, anti-war force that exists.
Well, I think this is a natural place to raise again our conference that's taking place in Detroit on November 5th. It's entitled Socialism versus Capitalism and War, and it will be articulating, based on the strategy and political assessment laid out on the World Socialist Web Site in the book that we were discussing, exactly what David was speaking about, a socialist strategy against war and to mobilize social resistance to the drive to global warfare that threatens to destroy humanity. And I would encourage all of our readers to sign up for that conference at sep2016.com/conference. Andrea?
David, you just concluded some of your remarks on this note, on this idea that the working class is a revolutionary force. And I actually would like to talk a little bit more about that. There is an essay in the book that I think deals with certain aspects of this. It's actually one of my favorites as a reader. It's called AntiAmericanism, the Anti-Imperialism of Fools. And it was written shortly after the events of 9/11. In this work, you deal with the question of the revolutionary capacities of the working class and the role of the American working class in history and its revolutionary history and the importance of that for socialism. Could you tell us a little bit more about what prompted the writing of this statement and what you think the fundamental political ideas within it are?
Well, there are two articles which are included in the volume. Actually, they were co-authored with David Walsh. One on the events of 9/11 themselves, and then the second essay, Anti-Americanism, the Anti-Imperialism of Fools. I just want to. The title of the second essay is taken from Engels' description of anti-Semitism. He says, "Anti-Semitism, the anti-capitalism of fools." That is the popular depiction at that time in the 19th century, and of course into the 20th century, of the Jewish people as somehow the instrument of capitalism. And this was something which found appeal among sections of the middle class who inclined toward anti-Semitism. Now, the reason why we decided to write this essay, because in the aftermath of the events of 9/11, which was a horrific event, I mean, nearly 3,000 people lost their lives as a result of a terrorist attack. And I must say those who died that day were, of course, not only the victims of the terrorists, but they were the victims of the policies which had led up to this, and the policies of war and interventions of the U.S. government. But in the immediate aftermath of that event, there were a number of columns which appeared, particularly in, I believe, the Guardian newspaper, by well-known middle-class lefts, who seemed to rejoice in this tragedy with the idea, well, now the Americans are getting what they deserve, and making an identification between really the innocent victims of who were in the Twin Towers and the ruling elites, those who actually implemented, planned, and are responsible for American policy. So we felt it was very necessary to disassociate the working class and Marxists from any sort of identification with this extremely reactionary, not just anti-American, anti-socialist, anti-working class conception. This type of radical demagogy, and that's one way of describing it, goes hand in hand with political prostration. Those who write this way, those who, they write this way because they see absolutely no basis for social revolution within the United States. They don't see a working class. They don't understand the nature of the social conflicts that exist within the United States. which make this country, with all its problems, with all its vast difficulties in the development of political consciousness, an essential and decisive element in a global revolutionary process. If you don't believe in the possibility of socialism in America, if you don't believe in the possibility of socialist revolution, you simply can't believe in the possibility of socialism. And that basically is an outlook which informs the politics of so many pseudo-left groups.
We have another question from a reader following up on the danger of war, who asks, especially considering the fatal war policies of the U.S. in the Middle East, how do the capitalists benefit from the wars besides the gains of the arms industry? How can anyone, even a capitalist, benefit from war by destroying complete societies, destroying factories, workforces, etc.? In the wars the U.S. led in the Middle East, it's all about the oil. But what happens in those countries besides bombing them and dividing them, creating ethnic and religious conflicts? Did the U.S. control the oil production in the Middle East, and how do they do that? Maybe it's a bit naive to confuse this question, but it's something I never understood.
Well, there are many factors which enter into it. Of course, oil is always a significant factor in the strategic calculations, but I think it's important to understand that from their standpoint, they see war within the framework of not just immediate economic gain, but from the standpoint of a global strategy, global dominance. And this has a logic of its own, which has very vast consequences. There is a section in the book where I had a correspondence with William Kaler. He is, I must say, an academic who I actually respect, who wrote a very worthwhile and valuable book on world diplomacy. But when I engaged in a correspondence with him in the period of the Balkan War, I was surprised by the way he so readily accepted the explanation that the United States was going to war simply on the basis of human rights issues. And he argued, I suppose he thought he was arguing against my position, but it was a vulgarization of a Marxist position, actually, that wars can be simply explained in immediate economic terms. No, there are always economic issues, but they have to be seen in a broader context. And in the case of the United States seeks to reverse, under conditions of broader economic decline, they are seeking to restructure the world in a manner which will secure American hegemony and, in the long term, allow it to again establish unchallenged economic predominance.
You can purchase copies of David North's new book, A Quarter Century of War, The U.S. Drive for Global Hegemony, 1990 to 2016, at Mering Books. There's a special sale for both the softcover and the hardcover version. David, there's one issue that just came up in what you were saying and also has been raised earlier in this evening's discussion. You mentioned the fact that human rights are used to justify these actions overseas. And part of the justifications that we hear, this came up in the Balkan Wars, it came up also in Iraq and Syria, is that ethnic minorities are being persecuted and that it's necessary to intervene on the basis to stop ethnic conflicts or to defend the position of particular national minorities. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your understanding of the role that this concentration on ethnicity and nationalism is playing in the expansion of imperialist violence.
Well, it's going to play a central role. And again and again, it is invoked as a justification for the intervention of the United States in one or another conflict, the right to protect and so on. And it is and of course it's played a very central role, since you've raised it before, in the politics of the pseudo-left. It's the central justification which they give again and again. And in this way, facilitate their alignment with the United States and other imperialist powers. If one considers concretely what does it mean to promote and invoke separatism, or to declare that issues of national liberation justify imperialist intervention, I think one has to look very carefully at its broadest implications in the world situation. And in this context, since you've raised it before, it's a very critical element of our opposition to the politics of pseudo-left groups, and it's very closely related to this, and that is the continuous emphasis which has been placed on, or the claim that Russia and China are imperialist countries. I'll try to explain what the connection is. We reject the definition of Russia and China as imperialist. We find it is unsupported on the basis of historical analysis, economic analysis, geopolitical analysis. But in considering this issue, why have these organizations been so insistent on identifying Russia as imperialist or China as imperialist? Now, we oppose Russian policy. We oppose Chinese policies. These are now bourgeois states, and there is nothing progressive in the policies which they pursue. We do not support the measures they take in the name of national defense, because they only become further factors in the explosion of military conflict. We base ourselves not on the policies of the Russian state or the Chinese state, but we seek to integrate the Chinese and Russian working class into a broader revolutionary movement against capitalism. But in relationship to this question, when we have considered why do these pseudo-left groups, why are they so insistent in their definition of China and Russia as imperialists? The reason is because if they are to be defined as imperialists, the next step is to say, aha, they're imperialists, they are carrying out policies of national oppression, and therefore we have to support whatever separatist movement emerges within Russia or China, or for that matter, in any number of other countries. Now, China, I believe, has approximately 55 officially recognized ethnic linguistic minorities. Among the most well-known, of course, is the minority in eastern Turkmenistan, Xinjiang. Russia has innumerable national, ethnic, linguistic groupings. So it provides unlimited potential for the development of various national separatist movements. And if they were to unfold with imperialist support, one's talking about conflicts which would cost the lives of tens of millions of people. And it would cut across every effort to establish the unity of the working class. But if one wants to apply the question of national separatism to other countries, well, why not India, where one has regional separatist conflicts going on in the Punjab, in Tripura, Mizoram, Manipur, Assam, Nagaland, and Kashmir. Africa has a population of approximately 1 billion people, and there are at least 50 to 60 distinct ethnic and linguistic groupings. Nigeria, the Sudan, Ethiopia, South Africa, the Congo, all are riven by internal conflicts in which are, of course, then manipulated by imperialism to achieve its aim. So we reject the utilization. We see nothing progressive in such movements. We are for the unity of the working class and not for the promotion of new mini-national states. Just in that context, if one looks at the situation in the Balkans some 20 years after the war, after the breakup of Yugoslavia, all the Baltic states are among the poorest, certainly the poorest in Europe, they're among the poorest in the world. They're scenes of social devastation, mass illiteracy. Nothing progressive came out of the breaking up of Yugoslavia.
This question of the definition of Russia and China as imperialist, I think, also raises a question of methodology and how to approach social and political categories. I'm struck that substantial portions of the book are devoted to methodology, particularly the lecture, Marxism and the Science of Perspective, and particularly the relationship that you draw between analysis and practice. Could you speak a bit more about how you employ the questions of method in the book?
Well, first of all, we're Marxists, we're materialists, and what sets us, if we want to speak purely on a theoretical, philosophical plane, what sets us in opposition to various petty bourgeois radical groupings who are embedded and fixated with the influence of postmodernism, the Frankfurt School, and so on. We believe there is an objective reality which can be known and which can be understood. And I'm speaking, of course, most directly to the issue of postmodernism. To the extent that it is possible to understand objective reality, it is possible then to formulate policies upon which we can intervene in a manner which advances the interests of the working class. For us, there is, as there is in Marxism, a intricate and dialectical relationship between the cognition of objective truth and human practice. Practice is a category of cognition. In seeking to understand the objective world, we include in our analysis calculations regarding the impact of our own practice. We don't look upon the world as if we simply stand outside of it. At the same time, we do understand that there are limits to subjective practice, that subjective practice is effective in a progressive sense to the extent that it is based on a correct appreciation of the objective potentiality. So when we speak, for example, the program of World Socialist Revolution, that is, and I suppose it comes as a shock to many to hear it, it is the most realistic of all programs. It is impossible to formulate an adequate anti-war program today if it does not take as its point of departure international conditions, international contradictions, and particularly, I want to stress this for our listeners in the United States, there can't be a settlement of accounts with American imperialism if you see the conflict simply in national terms. I mean, the American working class must recognize that its most powerful ally in the struggle against the ruling elite is the international working class. In the final analysis, it's the contradictions of global imperialism, which is the greatest revolutionary factor and the greatest factor undermining the dominance of American imperialism and the dominance of American capitalism within the borders of this country.
David, we have a question from a reader that I think is actually a really good question to conclude on because it brings together a whole number of issues that we've been discussing this evening and that you address in your book. You were just making the argument that the working class is a revolutionary class and that it's an international class. And prior to that, you were talking about the role of subjective practice in the political process and the transformation of objective conditions. A listener asks, how can the political consciousness of the working class be raised? Events alone are not enough to imprint a sound theoretical foundation for a war against war. Yet many people I know are completely uninterested or unwilling to talk about these issues. How can we engage them if, at least on the surface, they are unwilling to discuss these topics? Will events alone be enough to bring any latent anti-war sentiment to the surface?
Well, I think that events will play a colossal role in reawakening political consciousness and class consciousness. I recall remarks once made by Harold Robbins, who was the captain of Trotsky's guard in Kiowa Khan, and he had a discussion with Trotsky and posed a similar question to Trotsky about how will events change consciousness, or can events change consciousness? And he says, well, Trotsky replied, people respond differently to arguments, but everyone responds the same way to a red-hot poker. And events are red-hot pokers. It may be the case today, and to be blunt, because I don't think we should take a Pollyannish approach to this. The greatest danger today is the enormous gulf that exists between the enormity of the dangers which exist, the very real danger of war, even nuclear war, and the fact that that danger is not widely appreciated. It's not widely understood. I have no doubt that if it was widely understood that the wars will escalate and can have horrific consequences, there would be demonstrations everywhere. But that will come because events will impact. There will be what used to be referred to as war scares. There will be an acceleration of social conflict produced by the economic crisis itself. There are many, many signs of social distress. I mean, if we just look at what has happened over the last decade or so, the issue of social inequality has become part of public debate. When we established the Socialist Equality Party, the question of social equality was not widely discussed. It was, in fact, we were denounced by some tendencies for adopting this name. We were actually told that to talk about equality was a bourgeois issue. Now, the significance of social inequality is becoming very, very clear. And different classes respond in different ways to objective events. I think we're going to be witnessing a tremendous political radicalization, and that is an objective process. It is not dependent on predominantly on argument or on theoretical lectures. However, the spontaneous development of radicalization is insufficient. The spontaneous development of radicalization does not lead automatically to Marxist and socialist consciousness. That requires the building of a political movement, a political force. That requires a deliberate, organized struggle for the development of Marxist consciousness among the working class, among the youth, among the best sections of the intelligentsia, under conditions in which the objective situation will predispose an ever larger section of the population to take an interest in politics. So I think that's how we have to see this. There is a basic conception of Marxism that history never poses a task without providing the means for its solution. The task of preventing war, from preventing the destruction of the planet, the means for realizing that objective. War on war is provided by the development of the working class itself, and that's the basis upon which we conduct our political work. And I must say that the growing response to the World Socialist Web Site, the very substantial increase in readership over the past year, if I can make a plug for the very wonderful election and conference video, which has just been posted in less than a week's time. And this is the only video which has been made on war. I hope our announcers my interviewers will give more detail. But in just several days, over 45,000 people viewed this video. So I believe that indicates a rather significant growth in interest, a growing search for a political program. Slowly but surely, but certainly surely, people are becoming aware that there are dangers, and that will increase in the next period.
A Quarter Century of War, the U.S. Drive for Global Hegemony, 1990 to 2016, David North's new book, is available at Mehring.com. It's on sale, both the softcover and the hardcover version. I hope that all of our listeners here this evening will purchase the book. The wide-ranging and very interesting discussion that we've been having here, many of these issues are explored in much greater depth. And certainly the book is an essential read for all those who are interested in becoming committed to the development of a Marxist movement, the development of revolutionary struggle of the working class, and the expansion of political consciousness. So, David, thank you very much for being here this evening.
I would just also like to thank our listeners and readers, everyone who participated around the world in this discussion. I would encourage you to donate to the World Socialist website if you would like to see more events like this. We do not have any corporate sponsors. We rely on the working class and our readers for financial support. You can donate at wsws.org/donate or on the link in the comments of the Facebook feed. Finally, I would like to re-emphasize the point that David just made about the significance of the upcoming conference, which will take place at Wayne State University on November 5th. The conference is entitled Socialism versus Capitalism in War, and its aim will be to develop and articulate a political perspective for the working class to oppose war, both in the run-up to the coming elections and afterwards, for the development of a strategy going forward. Speakers will include David North, as well as our presidential candidates Jerry White and Niles Nemeth, myself, and Joseph Kishore. You can register for the conference, this absolutely critical conference, at sep2016.com/conference. I think that the debate last night points to the enormous dangers of war facing the whole working class in the United States and internationally. These critical issues are not being talked about seriously in the presidential election, and as David pointed to, our goal has been to ring the alarm for the working class of the immense danger of war and the necessity of mobilizing in opposition to it. So I would encourage all of our listeners to go take a look at the conference page, again at sep2016.com/conference, and sign up today. Again, for the World Socialist website, this is Andre Damon and Andrea Peters, and we'd like to thank David North for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.